That was absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much. It's so interesting to see how influential Socrates is and how much he taught so many people and still teaches them today without professing to know anything. See, I mean, he knew that people have to come to the truth that they can live by. He knew that they have to come to that of their own initiative. And so he called himself a midwife. Funny name for a man, but he was bringing truth out of people and assuring them that they had it in them. And one of his major dialogues is with a slave boy in the Meno, and his confidence in the capacity of human beings to achieve truth and to find their way through all of the institutions and power plays that were around them and discover as an individual that there is a God. Socrates believed in God. One reason why he had such confidence that he could work as he did with truth was he believed that there was a God who spoke to him and guided him. And he was sure of this to the extent that when they came to the point of putting him to death, he had no qualms about it, because he said, I'm going to a better place, and all I need to worry about is taking care of my soul, and everything else will be handled well. So we can certainly follow his example, and thank you for those wonderful words. Now this evening we take on the topic, is there a human nature? And the answer is yes. So we can go home. That wonderful statement that was put up again this evening by a past president, I believe, of this university: any system of education that ignores the moral conduct and the religious nature of the student is fundamentally defective. You see, as Kelly also brought out, I mean, this was the vision and the hope of all of the universities. And it still is. Let me tell you that in spite of all the smoke that is blown on this topic, people come to universities and live on universities because they want to find truth. And that's why I'm sure you came to the university. You want to find truth. And no matter what we may say in defensiveness, the need is still there. And the deepest need is for the understanding of the human self. We could have talked further about Socrates, and you remember his statement that the unexamined life is not worth living. And he meant by that the examination of the self, the coming to understand the self, and that this is the most important thing we have to do. And what we want to do this evening is to precisely examine the self, because until we're prepared to do that, we're not prepared to think about education. We're not prepared to think about curricula and the things that we lead people through. And until we're prepared to examine the self, we're not going to see the wisdom of that ex-president of this university in what he said. So we have to think about the makeup of the person. And I want to, because I might lose you in the intricacies of a few things I'm going to say, I want to just say up front, the purpose of human life is to love and serve others and to be loved and served by them. That is the purpose of human life. You don't have to be profound to see it. Watch a mother with a child. Watch how they relate to one another. Watch that little child look at its mother and almost drink in her soul and know her and love her, and the mother do the same to the child. If you look at human beings, you'll see that they live in what we can call circles of sufficiency. Circles of sufficiency. And in those circles of sufficiency, human life is completed. And when something goes wrong, we may say to a little child or to someone we love, everything's okay now. Really? Is everything okay? See, that is an ideal circle of sufficiency, of knowledge and love. Now, we all know that the mother and child is not sufficient to themselves. They require others around them. And those circles of sufficiency reach out to our neighbors, the ones that go through life with us. But the one thing that is constant is the calling and the need to know and to love, and to be known and to be loved. And we go through life with that as our calling. It isn't a deep mystery. It can be observed in life, but the problem is that all human circles of sufficiency are incomplete and broken. Even those that are most intimate and dearest. And in our world, that begins with men and women, and the problem of how men and women can be together. And if you don't have a framework within which you can take that and make it a circle of sufficiency, it turns into a living hell. And that circle of sufficiency between the basic one, between the man and the woman, is meant to be completed under God. That's why years ago Fulton Sheen had an old book called 3 to Get Married. You may remember that. It's a wonderful title. And the reason marriage is a sacrament is not because of some religious idea, but because in its very nature is at the heart of the value and goodness of life. The relationship between the parent and the child. All of these relationships between employer and employee, all of those are meant to be within a circle of sufficiency that finally concludes itself in the Trinity, which an old Puritan writer described as a sweet society in itself. God in himself is a sweet society, and his creative effort and redemptive effort is to reach out and bring those in who are broken. So I just wanted to tell you up front that that is what the nature of the human being is. It is a nature that makes loving and knowing central to human life. You know, people who have near-death experiences, one of the interesting things, all in common, is they all come back, and there are two things that they say that they want to focus on and know more about, and that is love and knowledge. Love and knowledge lies at the heart of the human being. And we have to understand that, or we can't have a basis to make statements about what education should be like. Love and knowledge go together, and they lead to being a creative will for good. And I just wanted to give you at the start a little picture of that, and then go back and go into more of the details. One of the things we have to say right at the outset is there is a human nature. And we are in a context where desire and will and freedom want to be unlimited. And in order to achieve that end, even as an ideal goal, many people have misunderstood the role of nature and have said, in order to have that as a goal, it must be that we have no nature. We've sometimes heard that in the feminist controversies, where it is proclaimed that biology is not destiny. And there's a very important point to be made with that. But in order to carry through with that point, many of our educators and thinkers, John Dewey was most prominent in this way. He wrote a book called Human Nature and Conduct, in which he denied there's any human nature. And he was after the idea that we could be endlessly progressive. But you want to understand that a nature is something everything has. And I want to give you just a statement of what a nature is. I think it's up on the screen here. A nature is a group of basic properties which determines what is possible for the thing in question. Now, not all the properties of the thing in question are a part of its nature. You might have a writing pen, for example. Whether it's blue or green is not going to be a part of its nature. But its rigidity is a part of its nature. Have you ever tried to write with a wet noodle? Right. So rigidity is a part of the nature of a pencil or a pen. And that's just, you can illustrate it endlessly, but do you get the idea now? It's a group of basic properties which determines what is possible for the thing in question. And of course we use that in our knowledge. Imagine a library where the classification is in terms of size and color. You go to the library and say, I'd like a blue book, please. 8 inches tall and 1.5 inches thick. Now, books have color, don't they? And they have size. We actually, USC, before we redid our main library, we actually had a whole floor where books were classified by size. You know why? To save space. So that row would be for 5.5-inch books. It'd be completely full, no wasted space. But you had to have a special code to go through to get the book. So they had to cross-list them with things that were indicative. Author is important. Subject is important. Date of publication is important. You see the difference between properties that are part of nature and properties that are not. And it's very important to understand that now. And everything has a nature in that sense. Now, not only does the nature determine what is possible for the thing in question and give it its basic structure, but rather it determines the excellence and well-being of things of that nature. Now, you might have a pencil, for example, that was not very rigid. You could write with it, but perhaps you'd have to wrap your whole hand around it or something to hold it rigid. Would you call that a good pencil? Probably not. And the reason is because its parts and its properties do not fit together to form a whole of that kind. So you'd say that's not a very good pencil. That's true of everything from a turnip to a horse to a squirrel, anything. If you know what a squirrel is, you know what a sick squirrel is, right? And you know what a healthy squirrel is. If you didn't know what a squirrel is, you wouldn't know whether it's sick or healthy, right? So now, is that second point relatively clear? The nature of a thing makes clear what the excellence and well-being of the thing in question is. And now then, I hope at this point you're going to say with me, everything has a nature. There isn't anything that lacks a nature. Everything is like that. And that's a piece of classical philosophy and wisdom that lasted well into the 19th and certainly the 20th century. You have a nature. A human being is not perchance a squirrel or a Brussels sprout. Right? You have a nature. And against that, we're judged in terms of our excellence or not. Sometimes we make fun of it. Randy Newman, of course, has the song you may remember about short people. Short people ain't got no reason. I have to pick them up to say hello. Right? Now, what's the point of the song? The point of the song is that's ridiculous. Why? Because being short or not being short has nothing to do with being human. Isn't that right? Do you see how that works? And we commonly accept that and work with it. And our philosophers, up until very recently, have generally assumed that. And we need to keep that in mind if we're going to make any sense at all of a discussion of human nature. So, second slide there now you'll see has to do with some spelling out of that. What is it to have a human nature? And forgive me if this is a little slow, but we need to be careful with it. To have a human nature is to have parts with specific properties that constitute the whole person in such a way that its peculiar wholeness provides a standard for what a human being is and provides norms for how a person is to be treated and what they are to do. And you will immediately see that a turnip or a horse and a human being are different. Now, why are they different? Because they have different parts. Those parts have different properties that found different relationships between the parts that make a whole that allows that whole to fit into relationships. My father lived through the Depression. He used to tell how they had little to eat besides turnips. And one of the reasons why they had turnips to eat is because turnips grow so fast. That's one of the very few virtues of turnips, in my view. Right? But of course, if you don't have anything else to eat, you need something that grows fast. And so a turnip has a nature. Everything has a nature. You have a nature. And if we had time to go into detail, we could talk about different cases of this. I might mention Plato's Republic. Many of you will have read it, I know, in your college careers. And if you remember that, Plato says, well, there are three parts to human beings. There's reason, There's emotion and there's appetite. Reason, emotion, and appetite. And each of these has certain properties. And because they have those properties, they relate to one another in a certain way. And for example, you want to be sure that reason is guiding your appetites by enlisting emotion on its side. Otherwise, you're going to be in total chaos. And so he lays out his theory. These properties relate to form a person who naturally lives in a social context because of those parts. And that's the other side of Plato's theory, is the republic or the city. It's how the city parts fit together because the human parts fit together in a certain way. To be good and to live well, as Plato says in that book, emotion, guided by reason, must direct the appetites to their proper exercise in the individual and society. And Plato is one of the most acute critics of democracy. He thought democracy lay right next to tyranny. You have to understand what he meant by democracy. And of course, democracy was the system that killed his teacher, Socrates. And he thought it lay right next to tyranny because democracy meant in his mind that all desires are equal. And if all desires are equal, the individual goes mad. Imagine living your life on that principle. And imagining a master desire emerging, which is able to subordinate all other desires and make them serve it. And soon you will see that democracy, in his view, would naturally lead to tyranny. Tyranny is often seen in our country in the case of people who are addicted to things. Addiction is a case of the tyranny of desire. And that means they do not have the capacity, that even the emotions cannot redirect their appetites because their appetites have become so obsessive and so masterful over their whole being that nothing can correct them. So that's just an illustration now. And we want now to approach the question, what are our parts and our properties, and how do they relate to one another to create a whole? Before we do that, we want to understand that the person who comes along and says, no nature, what that is about is the possibility of endless change. It's the possibility of endless change. To say no nature, no human nature, is to hold that human beings, there's nothing they cannot do. There is nothing that it is not appropriate to do to them. Endless change is possible. No limits. And our culture is very much tied to this. And we have to understand that a lot of the rationalization that goes into backing up this view that there's no human nature is based on the will to be able to change things without limit. It is in effect to make desire and human will ultimate. And when we do that, we run into the problem that human desire is not self-limiting. It can't control itself. Human desire has to be restrained by the capacity to apprehend reality. Experience and reason have to be able to set the limits to desire. In our life today, you'll see, for example, in commercials, the glorification of no limits. I don't know how many automobile commercials I've seen. I think all of them were advertising SUVs about no limits. And if you're just alert to this, watch the commercials that you see and see how they emphasize no limits as a model or an ideal for life. Also, camping equipment, I think I've seen advertised on that, and clothing. It is amazing in our culture the extent to which automobile fantasies are cultivated. And you get a good picture of how desire works if you watch how automobiles are advertised and what they will do for you. And what that means then is the supremacy of feeling. No nature really is a way of saying feelings. Kelly quoted the saying, if it feels good, do it. I used to have a girl that wore that on the seat of her pants. And you just wondered about maybe if I kicked her right hard and said I felt like it, if she would accept that. See, she was actually she wouldn't have worn that pair of pants if she had believed in it. She was being a hypocrite, right? Because it was only because she was in a world where people did not do things they felt they wanted to do that it would be safe to wear a pair of pants like that. But it's a fantasy. The same thing with our advertising I was mentioning. And that's where, as I mentioned last night, the supremacy of the body, abs and buns, as we talk about. We focus on the body and we try to get feeling out of that will fill our lives full, or food, or other things of that sort. And yet we can't get satisfaction. I Don't Get No Satisfaction was a very famous song a little while back. I understand some people still sing it. I don't get no satisfaction. Dr. Faustus, Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, is a wonderful illustration of the fact that you cannot, by desire, find fulfillment, that it will always lead you wrong. And actually, this idea of no nature comes out of the Renaissance. Pico della Mirandola had a book called The Dignity of Man. But what is interesting here is he said man has no nature because God created him that way, so he would have an infinite capacity to rise towards God. Now, actually, you have to have a certain nature to do that. But his way of putting it was to say, well, man has no nature. He can fall infinitely and he can rise infinitely. Actually, he can't do either one. But he does have a nature in which great possibilities are present if he understands that nature. And that's what I want to talk to you about, because you see, when you understand the nature of God, you realize its connection, the nature of man, you realize its connection with God, and you realize that there is an issue in here about infinity because of that relationship with God. Now, of course, nature has been falsely used, and we need to acknowledge that. Human nature has been used oppressively. What was not nature, whether it's short people or black people or whatever classification is used, that has nature arguments have been invoked to justify oppression in terms of what is just a historical accident. But one can correct these appeals only by getting the nature question right. And that, in fact, is constantly done today by those who are often say there is no nature. But they're appealing to nature in the process of doing it. And in a sense, that's the right thing to do. Now, then, moral knowledge disappeared from our present world, and it has disappeared. It hasn't ceased to exist, but it has disappeared, precisely because the idea of a nature for a human being has been set aside. And if you read contemporary moral theory in the 20th century and now in the 21st, you'll see that the constant issue that is raised, like Bernard Williams, a very famous ethical writer, says, well, if we could establish an end for human beings, then we might have a moral theory. We might have moral knowledge. But as it is, there's no first-level moral knowledge on his view. And all of the writers echo that same point. Moral knowledge disappeared in the Western world, first of all, because it was said that morals is relative, that moral judgment does not apprehend a reality that is there regardless of what we think. Well, of course, if there's no human nature, there's no reality there for it to apprehend. And then relativity in terms of feelings, because people do have different feelings, takes over. Rumors that only the sense perceptible is knowable. The will and human character is not sense perceptible. And if only the sense perceptible is knowable, then of course there is no moral knowledge. Rumors that only the measurable is known, and this is where often scientism steps forward and says, well, there's no scientific knowledge of love, of hatred, of intentions, of character. And these are rumors, you see, about knowledge that sets aside any possibility of moral knowledge. The idea that moral truth suppresses freedom and diversity. That if there were moral truths, people would not be free to do what they want. Well, yes, they would be free to do what they want. They wouldn't be free to do what they want and it'd be okay. See, that's different. They'd still be free, but they'd have to deal with the fact that they were injuring their own nature and the nature of those around. The idea that everyone should be able to do what they want, as long as nobody gets hurt. That's a favorite term. In Los Angeles, we are now facing the demise of the emergency healthcare system in Los Angeles County, primarily because people do what they want and say, as long as it doesn't hurt anybody. You see, I mean, that's true of nearly all of the areas of tremendous expense in public health today, is being primarily drained by people doing what they want rather than what they ought to do. Also, I mentioned here profound changes in the university. And I want to recommend a book by Julie Rubin called The Making of the Modern University. It is an excellent study of what happened in the university system over time in the last several decades, certainly the last century, so that there is no longer a body of knowledge to be taught about morality in the universities. And of course, these profound changes are all tied to the denial of human nature. So the outcome is actually that political correctness is the only thing that's left. Once you have set aside moral truth, moral correctness, and you will do that if you indeed think human beings don't have a nature. Once you do that, then the reason we have a big thing about political correctness is not a conspiracy of some sort. There isn't any other kind of correctness left. With human nature gone, all that is left is power, it is will, it is desire. And then politics and law rule. And politics rules law. Because instead of law being based upon a foundation of moral truth about human life, it has to be based simply upon what people desire. And judges and legislators wind up trying to reflect what they think is the sentiment of the people. Desire degrades the person to the body. And there's no foundation of dignity left for the human being. He becomes a consumer, a person who is simply striving to satisfy their desires. And Paul's analysis of Romans in chapter 1, which many of you I think will remember, where he talks about how when people turned away from the knowledge of God, they were abandoned to their own desires, and how that developed through utilizing the body. Because you see, if you turn away from a value structure that is there in reality, you turn away from God, the only thing you're going to have left to work on is your body. And you will pump that body for everything you can get out of it. And pleasure will be king. And that is what has happened in our culture. You don't retain God. You don't have a foundation for understanding human nature. And when you lose that, you simply go to what you can wring out of your body or the bodies of others. Now contrast that with a Christian reading of human nature. And I'm going to take this from the very familiar statements of Jesus. Love God with all of your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength, and your neighbor as yourself. And I want to just point out that what that really amounts to is what I said earlier. The call of the human being is to love and serve others, and to love, be loved, and to be served by them. And the whole structure of human life is set up around that. The structure of community. I mentioned parent and child, caring for a child. It's often been said in recent years by Christians and others that the mark of a decent society is how the young and the old are treated. And see, in order to make that right, you have to understand that people are not just for use, because babies and old people are useless. And if that's the way you think about them, that's all you have to say about them, then of course their treatment will be like it often is in our own culture. If you understand the worth and dignity of a human being in relationship to God and the whole human community, then of course you have a different place to stand, both individually and in society, about how they're treated. And let's just say that if we take the teaching of Jesus, we will be given a list of the essential parts of the human being, and I've put them up here. I hope you can read them. Jesus said, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. And that gives you a list. At the center of the human being is will, heart, or spirit. That's the capacity to make decisions. Human beings are creative beings. And that's true of every one of us here. And we want to create good. And that's built into a little child. And you watch a child, the first thing it wants to do is to make something. And before they can do things like put on their clothes and tie their shoes, let me do it. That's how they are. And that's a natural expression of creative will in the child. Everyone who comes through this life wants to leave the world a better place. Now, they may have become embittered and angry, but unless they have very peculiar circumstances, they want to be creative will, and they want to be creative of good. Now, in order to have a will, you have to have a mind. And in that mind, there has to be thoughts and feelings. Right? Because you can't make a choice unless you have feelings about that choice and thoughts about how it's to be done. You have to have those two things. And the mind contains your thoughts and your feelings. And it's a false abstraction that we live on, the idea that you can separate thoughts and feelings. You can't. They always come together. And I don't have time this evening to argue fine points in psychology. But they both belong in the mind, and that's what the mind is. It isn't just thoughts. It's thoughts and feelings, and both of those are required in order to be able to will. Anyone here tonight that doesn't have a will? Anyone here tonight that doesn't have a mind? See, mind and will are essential to human beings. Now, it's a good thing to have a body. That's essential for human beings. See, your body is your little power pack for life. It puts the capacity to act in your world, and without it you wouldn't have that. And at this stage in your existence, that's your source of power. Now, it's not your only one. It's one that you have, and God has given that to you, and you can even stand against God in the strength of your body. It's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. It's a wonderful thing. And because you have it, you insert yourself into the world, and you are inserted into the world. Your identity comes through your body. So in eternity, you will still be the son or daughter of certain people, because that's a part of your identity. And who we are is not something separate from the time and the place and the people that we're born in. History is of fundamental importance to human beings because it defines who they are and gives them the substance of their whole being. Social relations. No one stands alone. We live in relationship to others. That's a part of our being. That's a part of our nature. And finally, the soul. And the soul is the part of the person that puts all of the other parts together. If it's not a broken soul, it puts all of the other parts together: the will, the mind, the thoughts and feelings in the mind, the body, social relations, and makes one life. And you realize that there are many broken souls because not many people in our current condition manages to have a unified life. But ideally, that if we lived in circles of sufficiency that were unbroken and we're raised up in a harmonious way to know love and to be able to love, to gain knowledge, experience, grow, we would have souls that were unbroken. But our souls are broken because we live in a broken world where the circles of sufficiency have been violated. And we find ourselves crying out. We've lost loved ones. Terrible things have been done to us. And so that's the nature of the world we live in. Now then, God comes to us through our mind. And we respond to Him with our spirit. And He begins to pull us back towards wholeness. And the situation that is the common human situation that Paul expresses by the things I would like to do, I don't do. And the things that I would like not to do, I wind up doing. We are drawn out of that because our whole being is brought together in relationship to God, and we're able to be a whole person. So now the order proper to the human being is one that has all of these parts straight. Remember what I said? A nature is parts with properties that relate to one another in terms of those properties and produce a whole that is capable of relationships beyond the self. Now, the order proper to the human being is this: will subordinated to God. I'm not running my world. God is running my world. He's running the world anyway. I just come to terms to it, and I accept that. So the larger framework of things in which He has placed goodness, I serve, and I serve gladly. And I don't try to be God. See? I accept that. Will subordinated to God, my kingdom under God's, and therefore, at least in the process, because that's where all of us remain for a long time, and that's the way it works. In the process of harmonization of my neighbor's kingdoms and my own kingdom, then the mind subordinate to spirit under God. Instead of running wild with imaginations of all kinds of things, order comes into my mind. I see things rightly, I understand things rightly, and I act in terms of them because also my feelings now are coherent with my thinking. Now, I realize that sketching this out in an ideal way may be kind of hard to take in. But just think of it as an ideal. This is a process, and the feelings are becoming more and more harmonious. I'm freed of contempt. I don't have contempt for people. I'm not full of anger. I'm not cultivating my lusting for my own entertainment. I'm not spending time envying people and dreaming about, I wish I had what they had. Right? Why not? Well, because I've become alive under God and I don't have to think those thoughts anymore. Right? I'm now alive in God's kingdom and I know that I'm taken care of. And so I can rejoice with those that rejoice. Instead of thinking, I wish I had what they had. I can think, I'm glad they've got it. And I can weep with those that weep because my compassion is not just for me but for them also. See, the restoration now begins to move through the body and through the social relationships. Mind subordinate to spirit under God, soul to mind under God, body to soul under God, and social relationships then harmonized with the body under God. Now this is a picture of human nature functioning well. So just take a moment to look at that. It's based on human nature. And out of this comes the norms which can guide us practically. I mean, you think of all the things that, if we have a list of things to do and not to do morally, think of what they're about. Well, they're about knowing and loving. See, if you murder someone, steal from them, lie to them, that's not exactly knowing and loving. That's living in a world where you feel like you have to lie. You may have heard of the little girl who in Sunday school was asked what a lie is, and she said, it's an abomination to God and a very present help in time of trouble. See? Well, you see, if you're running your world, you're going to need all the help you can get. And that's why, for example, very few of us come to the point where we decide, I'm done with lies. I will not mislead anyone. See? Now think, if that actually happened in human life, the difference that it would make. Think of all the money and time we invest in protecting our goods. Think of a world where you didn't need locks. I was up in western New York talking someplace, and they said, we never lock our car doors except in summer, and we lock them to keep people from putting zucchinis in the back seat. Different world. Okay, so now we're living a spiritual life from God. The influx of God comes into our lives. We have given to us a life that is beyond ourselves, and that link to the kingdom of God is crucial to understanding human nature. You'll never understand human nature unless you understand that it is meant to be lived in a relationship of devotion and worship and love to God. And when you are looking for a way to distinguish human beings from other animals, always remember worship, devotion, dedication, and love to God. And that life flows into us, and it produces activity that we're not capable of on our own. And the great commandment then is fulfilled in real life. We can become whole persons, the parts in proper order and function, by living a life of worship and service to God and others in a power beyond ourselves. The great commandment is basic knowledge of how to live well and be a good person. And once you understand the nature of the human being, then you can see why that is true. There are no realistic alternatives to that. We have set that aside as knowledge, but we have not replaced it with a better view or even a significant alternative to this view of what it is like to be a whole person. And when we begin to experience it, we begin to see the beauty and strength of it as it begins to enter our personal relationships and restore them and transform our whole world. Now, we do want to say as we come to complete this discussion that this is not by will alone. It is not something that can be done just by human strength. It has to be touched by the grace of God as the life of God moves inward and gives us inward transformation. And this is the place of spiritual disciplines. Spiritual disciplines are not designed to remedy behavior. They're designed to transform the inward person. Solitude and silence, fasting, scripture memorization, service to others. There's no complete list, really. A spiritual discipline is something you do to enable yourself to do what you can't do by direct effort. The secret of spiritual discipline is indirection. It doesn't try to correct behavior. It changes the inner person. We don't want to become people who do the right thing. That's a trap. That'll kill you. We want to become the kind of person who does the right thing routinely and easily. And that's what it means to have the life of God coming into the person through the mind and the spirit, and then transformation takes place. The aim is to become in all dimensions of the self the kind of person who naturally and easily does what is good and what is right. You'll remember the words of Shakespeare, the quality of mercy is not strained. That's true of all virtues. It is the person who does easily the thing that is right, who has had the inward transformation that makes life whole. Now, moral life must be based on knowledge. We cannot hang it in the void. We cannot base it on good feeling or political action of various kinds. The human self is meant to act in terms of what it believes. And that's why it's important for us to talk about human nature and to understand what it is. Because only if we have beliefs about it that lead us to understand what it is good for, can we use it rightly. I go back to the opening of my remarks where I said, understanding human nature or the nature of anything is what enables us to know when it is excellent in its character, to know what's good for it, to establish norms for its guidance. It must be based on knowledge. We will have beliefs about what is real, and the task is to ensure that they are true beliefs. And you can be sure that if you believe that human nature does not exist, you will have no norms to guide your life. The secular mind drove the spirit out of reality, any reality it could accept, and because of that, it is incapable of establishing moral norms. And since the moral life is a matter of the spirit is the will and the character, it is inevitable that moral knowledge would disappear in our culture. And here we need to tip our hat to Nietzsche and say a good word for him, because what Nietzsche understood was if you take the Christian foundations out from a culture, it will collapse. And that's what he was so excited about. He was incapable of giving an alternative. And I'm just saying here this evening, and perhaps you'll want to quarrel with that, and that's fine. There are no alternatives. And it's in the nature of human nature that there should not be any alternatives. But he saw what was happening, and he realized that it was a complete disaster. Revelation is the source that we have to look for knowledge. Let's just make a simple statement about the Bible. I know there are many things that could be said about it, but you have to understand that the Bible is the best information on the most important topics that human beings have. Now, you would guess what I mean by the most important topics by what I've already said already. But among other things, of course, that would be human nature. The Bible is a tradition. It contains deep teachings. It is set up in such a way that if you're looking for what is wrong, you'll find it. The medieval thinkers used to say that if a jackass looks into a mirror, he does not see an apostle looking out. Mm-hmm. That's true, isn't it? And if you look in the Bible, really what you're going to see is you looking out. And I don't mean to put you in the category of the jackass. But it's a very instructive figure, and actually is used in the Bible, as some of you will know, looking into it as a mirror. And we want to be able to see ourselves and see ourselves for who we are, and that will always bring us to God, and it will always show us the right way to go, if that's what we're looking for. If we're looking for puzzles, we'll find plenty of them. If you want to sit up nights and worry about where Cain got his wife, be my guest. But we want to remember that this is the most vital knowledge, the best knowledge on the most important topics. Now, you can compare that to any writer that you wish. And there are many other good writers, I don't mean to deny that. But this is the source. It just happens to be, that's the way it is. I believe God has planned it that way. And if we look to the Scriptures in that way, we will find the guidance we need. And the need now is for those who believe this to present the way of Christ as knowledge and reality and as a picture of human nature. We need to put this in clear juxtaposition to all of the other teachings that are around us. In order to do that, we don't have to be arrogant and closed-minded any more than one who knows how to fix plumbing has to be arrogant and closed-minded about what they're doing. They can be open. They can listen. We want to be in the same spirit. And that is the spirit of the university as it has been traditionally conceived. And we want to live in that spirit. And when we do, we will find that we have a treasure of moral knowledge. The way of Christ contains the body of moral knowledge for which the world is dying. And keep in mind from last night what knowledge is now. We need to practice that knowledge, openly and honestly test it and present it. And in this way, make our assemblies of Christians the guiding light of humanity on the university campus, everywhere in life, including education and all of culture. Human nature, as it should be, is not the responsibility or possibility of the university at present. They do not deal with it because they cannot deal with it. We are the ones who have to stand up in such a way and lead our lives so that people will realize there's something better in life than they had ever dreamed. I want to close with a quotation from a Harvard professor named George Palmer, and he delivered a series of lectures in the field of ethics at Harvard in 1899, and here's what he said in concluding. He quoted a large number of people as to what ethics is about, and then he says, "Ethics is certainly the study of how life may be full and rich, not as often imagined how it may be restrained and meager." Those words of Jesus, announcing that he had come in order that men might have life and have it abundantly, are the clearest statement of the purposes of both morality and of religion, of righteousness on earth and in heaven. Thank you.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at www.veritas.org.